For almost as long as there have been computer games, there have been people trying to blame them for causing real-life violence.
Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history.
Always eager to blame the latest form of media, they apparently forget that violent crimes happened before the advent of computers. There are many ways game developers could react to this sort of nonsense spouted by the Daily Mail or Fox News, but one of the less conventional responses is with Harvester. No, not that one. Taking one of the few genres not generally associated with violence, the adventure game.
Oh, there's a monkey in my pocket and he's stealing all my change. His stare is blank and glassy, I suspect that he's deranged.
Oh, my dear, sweet, merciful Savior in heaven.
They set out to make one of the most sick, twisted and utterly insane games ever. The game places you in the role of Steve.
The swell name. My dog's name is Steve.
Who wakes up in a house in a small town with no idea how he got there. Yes, it's the old Amnesia opening again. The town seems to be stuck in the 1950s, and a woman claiming to be Steve's mother mentions that he's soon to be married to someone called Stephanie. We don't know much else about Steve, other than that no one believes his amnesia story because, well, for some reason I get the impression he was a bit of a kidder.
You always were a kidder, Steve.
Well, you always were a kidder, Steve.
You always were a kidder, Steve.
Well, you always were a kidder, Steve.
Well, you always were a kidder, Steve.
Okay, I get the message. Anyway, the town of Harvest is just your normal small American town. You've got your store, your school, your police station, your nuclear missile base guarded by a crazy man with no legs. So maybe the town of Harvest actually makes Twin Peaks seem perfectly sane. All the characters are basically crazy. Your mother, for instance, seems to be some sort of creepy world version of Eccles from The Goon Show.
The bake sale is on Friday, and yet you're baking the cookies now.
Never put off till tomorrow what you can do today.
But they'll be stale by then.
That's why I'm throwing them away.
And then cooking more?
To replace the ones I throw out.
Why?
Well, I have to. No one's going to pay to eat stale cookies out of the garbage can.
Almost everywhere in the town is open from the beginning, though there won't be much to do in some places until later. I spent a good chunk of time at the start of the game just wandering around talking to all the various maniacs.
Because I choose to raise wasps instead of bees, I'm frowned upon by the community. Why?
You should have watched more TV and read less Dostoevsky if you wanted to pass for an American, comrade.
But red meat is one of the principal food groups, and you've got to have it.
I think maybe you need a little more quality time.
Don't mind if I do.
Of course, this is just a start. In a while, things start to get really weird, but we'll get to that later.
So don't go away!
In terms of gameplay, Harvester works in the standard point-and-click style, with one unusual exception. You have an attack button. This is the only game I know of where you can lose within the first few seconds by walking out of your room, straight into the kitchen and murdering your mother. You don't get away with it though, and are promptly arrested as soon as you leave the house. Then this happens.
Somebody help me! What do you people want from me?
Too late for that, boy. Ain't it, Sergeant?
Indeed it is, Sheriff. Answers may only be found in the lodge, and you must be alive to seek them.
I'll get you next time, Gadget.
The game in general is very violent and often gory.
Violence is as American as apple pie and low SAT scores.
While it's partly to add to the unsettling atmosphere, a lot of the time it feels like they're just sticking in scenes that are just blatant attempts to shock.
If an A-bomb hits, what good is it gonna do to duck and cover?
Shit! Ow! Shit on a stickeroo!
The general goal of the game is quickly revealed as everyone around the town starts talking about the lodge and how much they want to be a member and how Steve should join. It turns out that to join, you are set tasks to complete. Basically, you have to go around Harvest, performing nasty pranks on people of escalating scale. It starts off fairly low-key with this.
There is in Harvest a man named Mr. Johnson. He owns a tucker. It is his pride and joy. I should like you to put a scratch in it.
Yep, scratching a car. This is where standard adventure gamer logic comes into play, of course. You have plenty of things that could easily scratch a car, but only one particular item will work. A screwdriver will cause damage, but apparently a key or a pitchfork do nothing. And while we're on the subject of puzzles, how was I supposed to know I need to move this particular cabinet with a furniture dolly to reveal an hidden switch to turn off the burglar alarm, which I didn't even know existed until I tried messing around with this window, at which point I got arrested even though this is supposed to be Steve's house anyway. While all this is going on, the only person Steve can find who doesn't seem to be from the Twilight Zone is his would-be bride, Stephanie. This being Harvester, intent on being adult, of course this rapidly leads to a sex scene. A very awkward, clumsily done sex scene.
Make love to me. Then take me. Now.
It really is terrible.
Yes, terrible.
You could possibly say that about the voice acting too, though really it works for the game. Everything is over the top and played for laughs anyway.
You always were a kidder, Steve.
Well, you always were a kidder, Steve.
So whether or not the actors are actually capable of great acting, the Amy performances here add to the weirdness.
That kind of interest is healthy for a young fellow. Steers him away from being a fireman.
Anyway, after scratching the car, you're asked to steal some cloth from the firemen, who are inexplicably a bunch of ridiculous camp cliches.
They've done wonders with the upstairs bedroom, but this garage defies color coordination.
Each of the tasks you're set has consequences worse than the original act, much to Steve's surprise.
I hear those silly firemen broke out the axes and hacked each other to death. Things never were the same between them after the firehouse robbery.
Somebody stole the barber's pole from that nice Italian. And then they left live wires dangling in a puddle, which Pastorelli immediately stepped in and fried.
Though frankly, by the time he gets to the last task of burning down the diner, he can hardly claim he doesn't know what he's doing. Finally, Steve gets admission into the lodge, though not before finding that Stephanie has apparently been murdered with just a skull and spinal cord left on her bed. This is probably the most hilariously bizarre scene in the game.
Don't you realize what's happened?
Oh, indeed I do. I can just hear the tongues wagging at the PTA. Was it suicide?
Never heard of anyone pulling their own spinal cord out before. Off the record, I'd have to say no. No, all in all, I'd say this was death by natural causes.
Natural causes?
You can't live without a spinal cord, son. Nothing unnatural about that.
That's got to be my favourite line.
Pshaw, you always were a kidder, Steve.
Oh, shut up. When Steve gets inside the lodge, that's when the game starts to get even crazier. It's a lengthy section of the game where you have to wander through dozens of rooms with seemingly random themes and even more random events. There's also a lot of combat, and the fighting system in the game isn't the greatest. All of this makes even less sense than the rest of the game up to this point. For example, it's odd to understand why beating the chess puzzle makes a chess master randomly slice his head open with an axe, or why drinking a beer summons an evil doppelganger version of Steve who just happens to carry the key to the till. You need to do this, of course, because how else are you going to get the money to pay for a cloakroom attendant to clean the acid off your clothes before it kills you? Anyway, this all goes on for ages and there's nothing of consequence, just lots of surreal nonsense. When you get to level 3, it presents you with a series of supposedly moral choices, but none of it makes a great deal of difference and it often ends up in a fight anyway. It's still a bunch of random ideas thrown together.
And some mothers complain that their children don't come to see them.
Mommy, you're so good. You're so good.
All of this is ultimately leading to a final confrontation where you're given a ludicrous revelation. The town of Harvest is all a virtual reality simulation designed to turn people into serial killers. This doesn't actually make much sense considering that if you try murdering anyone earlier in the game you get arrested and executed, but whatever. You're given two choices. You can live out the rest of your life with Stephanie, but stuck within the simulation. Or you can murder Stephanie, proving you're ready to be brought back into the real world to start your killing spree. Those are the only options you have. If you choose the latter, you end up with this.
Where are you going?
Nowhere. Nowhere at all.
What are you doing, son?
Playing Harvester.
That thing? I looked at it the other day. The very thought. Breeding serial killers. It's disgusting.
It's cool.
You'll rot your mind playing games like that. Don't you know people who watch violence become violent themselves?
That's bullshit, Mom.
No, it isn't. Why do you think they started cutting the violence out of those Roadrunner cartoons?
Roadrunner cartoons.
So this is a violent game called Harvester about a violent game called Harvester turning people into killers. It's all done in a satirical way, of course, as a reaction to the media insanity, but it's still quite a gutsy thing to do. Ultimately, as a game, Harvester isn't a huge success. The puzzles fall into the illogical traps that foil so many lesser adventure games, the combat is terrible, and as soon as you get into the lodge the whole thing falls apart, with all the atmosphere that was built up to that point being lost. But I'm going to take a turn here. The game has a lot of good points and I think it's been misunderstood over the years. I mentioned that it's satirical earlier, and it's a satire that hasn't really dated thanks to the nature of the media coverage of games. The whole thing is clearly a satire of 50s small-town America, but in a very specific way that only really falls into place once you get to that ending. While hugely exaggerated here, this is a time where society, taken in general, was racist,
The stupid Dago.
sexist,
What else is there for a wife but cooking and cleaning?
and homophobic.
Steers him away from being a fireman.
Are the moral guardians so intent on blaming games for all the problems in the world, really saying that things were so much better back then? The people who grew up in an era where cowboys slaughtering the country's native population were seen as children's entertainment.
Where would we be right now if the cowboys hadn't gone out west and butchered innocent people to steal their land?
So yes, the game does go over the top at times, and it does sometimes aim to shock, but there's more to this game than you'd realise from just taking a cursory look, which makes me glad I played it at least. It's certainly a game that I won't forget, especially this.
Well, you always were a kidder, Steve.